So welcome everyone to the STOA. Today's session is Game B, a dark Renaissance response with Alexander Bard, Cadell Last, Owen Cox, and Raven Connolly. So what is the dark Renaissance? I'll pull up a definition from Cadell. So it's a potential artistic, philosophical, and religious movement which seeks to reveal, affirm, confront, transform the more disturbing aspects of human condition as the only one way to organize society truthfully. And there's an online forum called where a lot of dark Renaissance activity is happening called the Intellectual Deep Web. And I actually looked at the emails I had with Alexander in the, it's October 2018 is when we created that forum together. Bard has done a brilliant job of weaving all these brilliant minds together in this one space, and it's been very philosophically rich conversations, but also has this like roguish trickster and like not giving a shit about playing nice vibes, which we quite like. And it's a good temperamental contrast to a lot of these other intellectual spaces out there, such as like perhaps Game B. So we're going to talk about Game B today. And so what happened, there was a premiere that happened on the STOA, a Game B STOA. And when I watched it beforehand, I was like, how's this going to land? There's probably going to be mixed responses to this. And mostly it was positive. Some people said it was cringe. Some people reached out to me privately and said, I didn't really like it, but I didn't feel like there was a space for me to critique it. And then on the intellectual deep web, it just dunked on the film and Game B altogether, which is one of the hobbies and pastimes there. So I said, you know what, beyond the dunking, there's signal in the dunking, and then there was a lot of philosophical content there to be addressed. So I invited 4 live players from the intellectual deep web and the dark Renaissance here at the STOA to critique this, the film maybe, but more generally Game B as a movement. So we have Alexander Bard, Cadell Last, and Owen Cox and Raven Connolly. They're going to be in Dialogos today. So how today's going to work is I'm going to take in Raven in a moment, but if everyone could turn off their cameras, actually, except the 4 people that I just named. So we're here for 90 minutes in total. It's going to start where Raven, Cadell, Owen, and Alexander are going to share their thoughts, maybe 3 to 5 minutes, critiquing the film and the Game B movement. And then they're going to have a 4-way conversation for about 60 minutes about whatever's alive. Raven will be kind of like the soft Dialogos conductor, and then she'll take me back in, and then we'll have a Q&A. So if you have any questions anytime, put them in the chat. I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself. You can ask your question to the panel. And I think the order of who will go would be Raven, Owen, Cadell, and then Bard, the Trickster King, last. So that being said, I will take in Raven. And then the prompt is just a general critique on Game B or specific critique on the film. So Raven, you are it. Oh, and yeah, you can't unmute yourself. Okay, there you go. You can unmute yourself.
Wonderful. I love being in bondage, so not being able to mute myself is fun. So basically, I'm excited to be here today. I was very happy to get this invitation. I, like many others in the Game B scene, watched this film, and I found it to basically be invigorating by what was missing from it. The things that were absent from the story were what was most glaring to me in terms of my response. I did find myself grateful that someone actually went through the effort of producing a film. It's not an easy thing to do that, and so I'm definitely grateful for that provocation, the provocation of something incomplete, something that can be punched at and generated energy from, just because it's placing something out there in the middle for all of us to engage with, but kind of like a tweet, it's not saying everything. And because of that, there's this engagement, this draw, this almost like a vacuum that brings me into it. to come and want to point out all the things that it's missing. And, you know, in terms of the story of the film itself, I think it is, I mean, we could dismiss it. We could say, okay, well, you know, it's just a short, it's an animated short. You know, the story itself is not that important for showing what Game B is about. But I think in a way, the story itself shows what is incomplete about the ideology. So it actually is an important thing to look at, the very content of the film, the storyline, the way that the film is being presented, the fact that there is not really a plot. There's no plot, there's no conflict in the story. And the protagonist, the female character who goes through this initiation, I found her to be kind of scared and flat and incomplete as a character. Like there was nothing that was really bringing me in to the subjective experiences of these people. And the way that the whole thing was presented had a kind of flatness to it. So, well, I think that there is a larger critique to be made, and where we can kind of draw out some bigger ideas from the Game B space. There's actually something in the film itself that allows us to see what are the blind spots in this movement. What are the things that are being left out? And I think primarily, even in just the nature of the plot, literally conflict, literally like the thing that drives storytelling was missing. There wasn't conflict. You could have had a narrator just tell the story in a kind of pedantic way, and it would have made really no difference. That the characters themselves were not really actually subjectively involved in the story. They were just vehicles, you know, for some sort of explanation or some sort of a simplistic narrative. And I think that that does speak to something that's missing and why it has yet to produce great art. There isn't this embrace of conflict as an aspect of human being that cannot be transcended. That's actually part of our presence on this earth. It's part of what we have to engage in the passions. There is no easy exit from this. And if we don't engage with this truthfully, with a full experience, then we're just going to end up in this kind of, we're just going to fall flat. I mean, it's like a you know, limp dick. It's just going to fall flat. So that's kind of my initial feelings about it. And I think the Dark Renaissance and the energy of the IDW is very much, I mean, is very strong, very oriented around conflict, embracing desire, embracing death, embracing the things that we're falling, that we're running away from. And that's why, you know, even though for me, you know, I was just thinking about my own experience on the IDW and how in the beginning I was a little scared. You know, it's really aggressive, and I was like, oh, I don't know how to speak on this platform. But like over time, I've actually been able to confront my own kind of vulnerability and feelings of shame that prevent me from exposing myself to the world, right? And so seeing how this environment of conflict and aggression that happens on this forum is actually producing the character of people who can actually deal with the real conflict of human existence, the real complexity of human existence. We actually have to embrace this conflict. That's the only way that we can actually develop the character that will allow us to deal with the complexity of the world that we're living in, because we're falling into a state of collapse, right? That's serious business. And that is actually the eruption of violence. That's not going to cause us to fall into some sort of easy utopia. It's going to cause an eruption of violence, right? So I think that there's a lot in the medium itself, in the story itself, that we can use to kind of show and illustrate the incompleteness of Game B, and then the very kind of process of which the Dark Renaissance as a movement or as an idea even came into existence through this forum, and the practices in the forum and the debate and the conflict is kind of part of the birth of a potential artistic movement that can engage with conflict, that is brave enough to do that, is brave enough of being vulnerable and exposing ourselves and exposing our shame and the things that we want to hide, that may actually in the future create some kind of art that will enrapture everyone who's watching, that you will not be bored, that you will be drawn in, that you will be stimulated, that you will be scared, that you will be horrified, that you will be totally reoriented because of an immersion in something visceral. So that's the thing that I think I'm trying to at least intellectually get at here, is like, how can we engage with concepts that allow us to see what this is, what's missing, and then can that be a provocation into our souls and into our guts, that gives us the impetus, the drive to actually produce art. And that's the other question here, is like, what is the drive that gets people to produce real art? Is it really some sort of harmonious, tranquil, kind of like flat thing? Or is it this kind of tension and drive and feeling of aggression and incompleteness that gets us to make great art? So those are some questions and thoughts that I'm having. And I'll give it over to Owen.
Fabulous. So who knew that Raven liked being in bondage? That's fun. So I mean, I guess in my introductory stuff, the thing I found myself thinking when I was like watching the movie, and particularly the response to it, the Game B Dialogos, is about the way that the Game B movement itself is thinking about art. And so for like a 90-minute conversation, supposedly about art and the movement, the only work of art, as far as I can remember, that was referenced was Star Trek. And the only artist was Daniel Schmachtenberger's friend, who's an artist. Right. So of all the history of art and all of the history of artists, that's all that's mentioned. It's almost like I found myself thinking, you could write a satire, say, of the like Soviet Ministry of Culture sitting around and going, okay, what are we going to do about communist art? Well, okay, Daniel, you saw a folk play once 30 years ago, and you know a friend who's a poet. That's good enough. Let's go from there. But so I started to wonder, like, what is the theory of art that is kind of, that seems to be working in this space? Jordan Hall, who often I find of the kind of like Game B luminaries, my thinking is closest to, and I appreciate his perspective and been most influenced by his perspective, is talking about art coming from the one. The artist is somehow in deep communion in a non-rational way, I think, with this thing that is existing in the kind of collective space and wanting to communicate it. That, I think, is what his kind of perspective is. Daniel Schmachtenberger says something about using artworks for a kind of ontological design, kind of cathedrals to build culture that will enable us to live more beautifully. Now, perhaps Cadell is going to talk a bit more about this idea of like the one or not, I don't know. But what both of these kind of perspectives smell of a little bit to me is a kind of top-down Platonic way of thinking about art and culture. And Plato in his Republic famously actually said, the poets should not be allowed to speak because the poets deceive people and the poets tell lies and tell all this confusing stuff. Now, of course, these guys didn't say that explicitly. And I'm not accusing them of saying the poets shouldn't speak. But why is Plato saying the poets shouldn't speak? Well, there's something about, he's kind of in the context of, say, of ancient Athenian culture, where the high art is tragedy, Greek tragedy. And tragedy is, in some sense, horrific. It's about man trying to grapple with the brutality of nature. Like, look at Oedipus Rex. He kind of tries to save the kingdom of Thebes that he's been put in control of and ends up just destroying himself. Or even look at the Aeschylus's Oresteia, for example, which is kind of seen about the triumph of rationality and civilization over pagan spirits, and the kind of democratic council of Thebes at the end fixes things. But the democratic council can't fix things. And in the end, there has to be a kind of God come down from without to save things, which is a nice kind of fantasy. But it's kind of I always thought that was a bit of a cop-out ending, as if the humans are always inevitably stuck. They can't quite resolve the conflict that they resolve themselves in. And so if we're taking a perspective on art, and I certainly find that it is this tragic impulse, which shows up again, like Nietzsche, one of the great thinkers on art, who perhaps I'll get to in a second, and then like Paglia, who draws from him, the kind of 20th century critic, they're influenced by this way of thinking about art as the tragic, or the kind of confluence of the Dionysian forces with the Apollonian forces. So Apollonian forces being man's attempt to create beautiful structure and harmony and hierarchy, and Dionysian forces being the ways that nature, sex, violence interrupt and fuck up everything that we try and do. And to go back to that Platonic perspective, it almost sounds like to me that Republic perspective is, let's try and get rid of these Dionysian poets, because we're trying to build a beautiful political order and we're trying to make things work. We're trying to be in communication with the one. And what they bring is actually something that disrupts this. Now, I guess just to add a little bit at the end before I sling it on, what theory of art do I find myself influenced by? Well, it is that Nietzschean Paglian tradition that I spoke of, where the work of art is kind of deeply personal, and it's in some sense the artist trying to grapple with the impossible struggles that they confront in their own life, their sexual fixations, their violent impulses, their desires for power, or their sufferings in the past over power and sex and relationships and so forth. And yes, trying to conquer over them to create something beautiful from them. But there's always a sense, say, of tragedy to it. The work doesn't complete anything or inaugurate a new beautiful world order. If anything, it just kind of presents the impossibility. And at the best, there's like a short satisfaction. I mean, I've just finished reading like The Red and the Black by Stendhal, and it's a kind of brilliant but really sad depiction of how just people can chase power and destroy relationships around them. And as far as I know, like kind of based on a lot of the author's own experiences of wanting to be an artist and wanting to be great. And I suppose the game B critique to that might be, again, that, well, this is all game A dynamics, and what you're talking about is art that's trying to explore game A dynamics and struggling with it. And I probably used up my time, so I'll sling it on, but I guess it's just the doubt that we can ever really overcome these game A dynamics, that art is kind of the best shout we have at trying temporarily to gain some release from these conflicts. But they will inevitably swallow us again. And if the artistic perspective that we're working with doesn't grapple with that, if it's kind of in this utopianism that we're going to solve sex, we're going to solve violence, we're going to solve power, we're going to solve mutual destruction, we're going to solve accelerating rivalry, and so on, then it's going to neuter itself. And ultimately, artists are just not going to go to that movement. They're going to go elsewhere. Cadell.
All right, fantastic, Owen. Yeah, and I just want to sort of reaffirm everything that Raven and Owen have already said, both about the dark renaissance and the intellectual deep web being a space where we try to really embrace sort of a mode of being, which is building character, which necessitates being in conflict, being in tension, being in incompleteness, being in not knowing, and sort of irreducibly so, and also approaching, approaching the real of human life, inclusive of sexuality and power and money and conflict, not in a problem solution framework, in a linear framework. These are not things that are just going to go away, that we can just get rid of. In terms of game B specifically, I'm kind of intellectually salivating a little bit, to be honest, because it's just almost like it's set up perfectly for like what I've dedicated the last 5 to 10 years of my life towards, which is basically dialectical thinking and unconscious thinking. And if you're interested in those modes of thinking, that's basically what I guess the pitch for what I've done with my intellectual career has been about. And dialectical thinking operates on a logic of A equals B. So in dialectical thinking, and it's just precise sort of structure of paradox, that dialectical logic doesn't structure in a logic of we're in game A bad. We need to go towards game B good. That's not how dialectical thinking works, and it requires a perspectival shift on the part of the knower to stop setting up these simplistic games of game A bad, go towards game B good. That very mode of thinking is problematic. So like, for example, this appears in the very narrative structure of game B, which is the popular representation to the world of what game B is trying to say, where basically you have a situation where game A, you're parasitized. Game A, you're competitive. Game A, you are far from equilibrium. Game B, non-parasitized. Game B, cooperative. Game B, thriving. Right? It's the consequence of that is that you fall into the fundamental trap of ideology, which has unreflectively structured so much of human history. So, for example, and this is a very precise structure of ideology, what happens in ideology is there's a certain temporal structure. The temporal structure is, in the beginning, we were whole. There's wholeness. In the beginning, no one was excluded. In the beginning, there was no domination, right? And then we fall into history. And in history, there's exclusion. In history, we're divided. In history, there's domination. And then we're going to try to return to wholeness. We're going to return to a state where there's no more exclusion. We're going to return to a state where there's no more domination. This is basically, and the mechanism by which this temporality gains its legitimacy is by creating a very simple enemy obstacle. Namely, game A is the game everyone's playing, and it's rivalrous, it's accumulation, this is not thinking. This is not thinking, in my view. And I know that's maybe harsh, but there's a way in studying real philosophy, and in particular, understanding really what dialectics is. I think it has a universal dimension to understand dialectics. And if you don't go through dialectics, this ideological trap is very easy to fall into. So it's really about the standpoint of the knower to embrace paradox, especially paradox in heightened complexity, where we need to think we need to actually think competition. We need to actually think exclusion. We need to actually think domination, how these things really work. We need to understand our minds, the most disturbing aspects of our minds. You think exclusion is going to go away in sexuality? Do you think domination is going to go away in sexuality? Do you think competition and rivalry is going to go away in sexuality? Like, most intellectuals don't realize that their very thinking is a foreclosure of intimacy. Their very thinking is a way to get out of intimacy, instead of actually realizing that their thinking is tarrying with very intimate spaces and very intimate grounds. As Raven and I recently did a family symposium, which tried to actually discuss this in the real. And before I pass it over to Bard, I just want to say, in the course I'm teaching right now on dialectics, there's a huge problem with this way of thinking, game A bad, let's go to game B good. There's a huge problem with this thinking that has recurred over historical time in major problematic ways. So oftentimes when subjects on a mass scale try to directly affirm a utopian freedom, what ends up happening is, because they don't realize the complexity of the situation they're in, they end up becoming slaves. They end up positing freedom and becoming slaves, or like becoming under some tyranny. I mean, it happened with the French Revolution, and it happened with the Communist Revolution. And I think it also applies to sexual spaces when, for example, you try to escape monogamy by positing non-monogamy as freedom. and then you end up in slavery again. So you end up in a new form of slavery. So this way in which conscious subjectivity, in not understanding the unconscious, posits some freedom which it thinks it knows. As soon as it tries to act it out, it ends up in slavery, because you're not thinking through the fundamental paradoxical nature of existence. The only other thing I would say is, before passing it on to Bard, is that we are living in a time where we're approaching problems that humanity has never approached before. And because we're living in a time where humanity is approaching problems we've never approached before, the temptation to ideology is going to be increasingly strong. So I think for that reason, we need to become the type of subjects that can be dialectical thinkers, meaning we embody paradox, we can think paradox, and not as something where we're going to get out of it. That's just the nature of being a knower. And then we need to be able to realize what unconscious thinking is, which is that there's a knowledge inside of you which you don't know about. And that if you're not aware of that knowledge inside of you, which you don't know about, if you don't try to become aware of it, it's going to over-determine the ideological fantasies of your political life. So I'll pass it to you, Bard.
Okay, first of all, let me cover my ass. Jake is a really great kid who's made an animated movie, and he tries to study my philosophy, and I honor him for it. So he's got a great future. Thankfully, though, this little animated movie got about 4,000 views, while Candy B's latest ass-shaking video got 400 million. Candy B, to me alone, speaks volumes here, because I think what we're talking about here, I love the liminal web, but I think it rapidly needs its adultification. So we need the adultification of the liminal web. And I think that's an overall theme for this discussion. I think it's long overdue. And once we can get that right, there's so many people in here that I love. I'm great friends with Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall and these guys. And maybe we'll go into more conversations over the year. Maybe we should stay within this conflict right now. I'd love there to be a conflict between, say, dark Renaissance and metamodernism, whatever you want to call it, because I think it's incredibly creative and fruitful. But what we're trying to point out here is that you cannot do futurology without understanding philosophy, and you cannot do philosophy any longer without understanding psychoanalysis. That's just impossible. Let's just face that and start there. Escaping that truth today is going straight back into Christianity or back to Rousseau or any of the sort of rubbish we tried to clean up for the past 300 or 400 years. That's not enlightened at all, and it's certainly not going to make us encultured. So if you want enculturation here, we've got to start with the realization that psychoanalysis is absolutely necessary for philosophy. And without philosophy, we can't do futurology. We just end up in banality. So as for this little movie and for the game B ideology as a whole, this is just Chinese Communist Party propaganda. I don't see anything at all in this movie or in the game B ideology, and I pointed it out to Daniel and Jordan privately, that, you know what, the Chinese Communist Party would love you guys, because there's no difference. This is the little boy trying to impress his mom. And that's where you arrive when you try to do mythos and logos without the pathos. Human beings, or narratology, you know, the sort of philosophical science of the sort of stories human beings tell each other, narratology. Narratology starts with understanding the 3 different narratives, and we must have all 3 at all times. Everything that works for human beings over long periods of time are triads. Dialectics starts with triads. So, and what often happens, especially in American discourse, is that it ends up in between the mythos and the logos. And mythos and logos on their own, without the pathos, they lose it. This is the difference between the Jordan Peterson we all love, who gave us lectures on Nietzsche and Freud 5 years ago, and Jordan Peterson, who became a rock star propagandist. He left the pathos, he left Paglia, he left Nietzsche, he left Freud, and suddenly he became some kind of a neo-Christian conservative. I don't know what they gave him, what kind of drugs they gave him in Serbia, but, you know, I want the old Jordan back. I think that's absolutely essential. But I think we need to understand we have 3 different narratives. You got the pathical, and you got the logical, and you got the mythical. It is the pathical that people are terrified of. And what's lacking in game B ideology is the complete avoidance of pathos. It's the avoidance of adult grown-up sexuality. It is the avoidance of violence. And without sexuality and violence, you cannot have art. It becomes banal. We can also look at this from a more perspective, what I would critique against metamodernism, since the metamodernists apparently love this little movie and apparently are very eager to put the little Platonist hands together and applaud to this little saga. I would say that if you think through nihilism properly, nihilism is 4 different stages. So we realize we're at the end of a paradigm. We call that paradigm the capitalist, industrialist, individualist paradigm. And we're replacing it with a digital, interactive, potentialist, certainly tribal paradigm. The Stoa is part of that. What we're doing at the intellectual deep web is part of that. It's all part of that, right? So the liminal web is like a shamanic front that tries to confront the new realities of a new society we walk into. Some people call this a meta crisis. I think the meta prefix is a bit overused by Americans. I prefer to call it the crisis. It's more humble that way. But nihilism goes through 4 phases. Nihilism always starts with naive nihilism. You don't know that God is dead. You don't know that your paradigm is dead. You don't know that your parents' worldview doesn't work any longer. It's become irrelevant. It's dialectically done with, okay? You don't realize that yet. Second phase is cynical nihilism. I usually say that cynical nihilism is Hillary Clinton going to church on a Sunday pretending she's a Christian. Nobody believes Hillary Clinton is a Christian. Everybody believes she's trying to keep a little family together, and the family should conquer and own the world. That's all she wants, right? She's just a queen like that. She's like a ruthless pagan queen. She's not a Christian. Come on, right? So a cynical nihilist is a person who knows that God is dead. They know the paradigm is over. They haven't seen anything new, and they don't want to see anything new. They want to rule through the cynical nihilism. They're perfectly happy with the cynical nihilism. And that's basically where most of philosophers ended up, and a lot of artists ended up. And, you know, the whole postmodernism thing essentially is one huge clumps of cynical nihilism, right? It says history is over. We ended up here. But that's not true, because if we just look at previous paradigm shifts of history, when a new technology has introduced itself, so it was spoken language, written language, printed language, now an interactive language, the internet. Hey, that's what California is the center of things, because that's where it happened. The printing press this time was not created in Germany. It was the internet, and it's California by origin. Thanks to California for that. But when we go through into the new paradigm, it takes off in 2 different directions. And one of them is ironic nihilism. And that's what I like about metamodernism. That's what I like about Daniel's and Emil's book, Hansi Freiner, right? Another bearded guy, you know. But I like about metamodernism is the idea that ironic nihilism must fall after cynical nihilism. We can get out of it. And that's a good one. But it has to go towards something affirmative. So you can be ironic about the past. You can be ironic about now. But to switch from the ironic to affirmative, you must go sexual. You must properly grow up. You must embrace violence. To do anything that's genuinely transformative. If you don't do that, it's not art. And if you don't have art, you're dead. And everything becomes decorationism. It just becomes decorated. And that's when you make little movies, animated movies that the Chinese Communist Party would approve of. Like, because there's no life in it. It's just childish or dead. Childish or dead. It's like you're an 11-year-old trying to tell a fairy tale to other 11-year-olds about how beautiful everything was, and you all fell down into a trap, and you're going to go back to the beautiful. I don't even use the word beauty any longer. I think it's dead. Stop using beautiful. Stop talking about beauty. Beauty is dead. Let's kill it. The Dark Renaissance should first of all kill the word beauty, period. Ban it, the B word. We don't say it, right? So you have to rethink aesthetics. You have to rethink aesthetics. The potential right now is fantastic, because anybody writes a Netflix script knows. The resources for art are out there. They're amazing. We should go towards affirmative nihilism right now, which is affirmative, which is only nihilism looking from the old paradigm. The affirmation from the new paradigm, looking from the new paradigm, it's novelty, you know, it's creativity. But that could be a wartime or whatever. I don't care. I just want it to be alive and libidinal. I want it to be adult. And I think that's where we need to go. I really have to look at the affirmative nihilist aspect, which is lacking in metamodernism, which is precisely, I'm going to end this little tirade by saying that this is precisely why metamodernism has not produced any metamodernist art, because there couldn't be any. There couldn't be any. Metamodernism postmodernism was the death of art in itself. There's no resurrection of art coming out of metamodernism at all. We need a dark renaissance. We need to go back into psychoanalysis. And the only place where we can find creativity is in the shadow, in our own shadows. our own mutual shadows thrown together and fucking each other. That's where creativity comes from, nowhere else.
Great, amazing.
I'm loving this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think like that something that one of the things that's conspicuously absent from the film is sex. There's no sex in this film, right? There's no moment of sex. There's also then no narrative conflict, right? So I think those things are actually tied together quite well. And Cadell, I think you mentioned this when you're, yeah,
Raven, in game, because in game B, everyone's whole, so there's no need to have sex.
Yeah, and there's no sex. It's just the end, right? It's just some sort of like collective suicide, right? It's just a sublimation to the death drive, right? We'll just stay children forever, then we never develop our secondary sex characteristics. We actually never go through puberty. We never go through the passions, and we just stay in a childlike state. And somehow we never have these feelings of violence or possessiveness or horniness that kind of drive us as we're adult people, right? I think it's a question of like, this is where psychoanalysis comes in for me, is like, how do you channel drive? How do you channel drive, right? And to basically exile all of the aggressive and conflict-ridden drives of human existence is to create a new kind of living that does not embrace the totality of human existence, and in fact is casting it out into the shadow. Because it's interesting, right? Like I would imagine that there's a lot of conflict in game B. I would imagine that there's conflict between figures in game B. I would imagine that there's issues, and we just don't see them, right? Because they need to be hidden, because there's this idea of all these figures at the front of it as being like kind of whole, non-rivalrous people, right? And so if you do that to your own movement, then you have to put these things into the shadow, right? You have to kind of cast them away and keep them out of people's view, because you have to maintain this illusion that we're living in a non-rivalrous way. We don't have these problems, right? We don't have these problems, when in fact, no matter what you're doing, no matter what aspect of life that you're moving through, you're entering into states where conflict shifts and changes and continues to challenge you throughout your entire life, right? You can't actually cast yourself away from these problems. And in fact, embracing them is what develops the character potential, so that we can actually engage in the creation of life, right? Of something that is juicy and provocative and actually produces energy, right? Produces energy. We're all seeking energy. It's how are we channeling that energy, and how does it hit us in our bodies? And the aggressive impulses, the sexual impulses, the fact that energy is just arousal, and arousal is rooted in our genitals, and that aspect is like where the root comes from, that travels through our bodies and invigorates us, that our sexuality is inextricably linked to our ability to channel energy. And the funny thing about this, Jim Brett, I love Jim Brett. He's great. He's a great personality. I love how cantankerous he is. And I'm like, he was clearly embracing conflict in his life. He's clearly embracing, like getting into trouble and doing drugs. And like, he was probably very sexually vigorous as a young man. And just like, he is this kind of person. And yet his ideology doesn't actually completely embrace this as an idea for everyone, for the way in which we actually build the world. So there's a kind of irony in all of this as well, in terms of like his blind spots. Because yeah, it's just I don't know, that's just a funny thing to me about Brett. I think go ahead.
I can add a couple of things. I think the problem is that the game B ideology has come out of California, and California is suffering for what I call New Age. New Age is essentially when you go to the homepage and 11 speakers attend a conference and they're all smiling. They're all smiling, like militantly smiling, right? And it's so sales pitchy, and it so wants to be the nice guy, but it cannot speak truth because of that. But I think what's great here is that we're also part of this. We're also part of liminal web, and we will be thrown out of California New Age in no second at all, because we don't smile. That's enough to be thrown out, right? You're canceled as soon as you don't smile. But so there's a maturity here that we can build from, and I think that's why 2022 should definitely be about this dialogos. I think it's fantastic. But I like to point out that why it's dangerous. Okay, we look at the game B ideology, the way it's really, really dangerous is precisely because when there is no solid phallus, the problem here is on the masculine side, not on the feminine side of history. When there's no solid phallus here, when there's no admiration between the priest and chief, things fall apart. I'm a huge fan of the Bronze Age. I think the Axial Age is incredibly overrated. One of the themes where John Fabark and I strongly disagree is that he thinks Hellenism was disaster. I think Hellenism was the best thing ever. Hellenism was a period like we're looking at the Dark Renaissance, right? So I would say that when the phallus falls apart, it becomes two 11-year-old boys who are terrified of big penis. And I call them the Pillar Saint and I call them the Boy Pharaoh. And the problem is that when the Pillar Saint steps forward, he dreams about a top-down society where he's an urban planner and he's in charge of absolutely everything. And he creates a beautiful little perfect society with square streets and the same buildings. It looks like Plato and Hitler. You know, it's just like, that's what the 11-year-old boys want, because they want a world free from sexuality. So they want beautiful buildings that are perfectly square, and they want their mother to applaud them when they design these buildings. There's a Pillar Saint. And the Pillar Saints are what we got with the Axial Age. The enormous amount of affluence created about 800 years before Christ all over Eurasia created the Pillar Age, the Axial Age. And the Axial Age produced a lot of little boys who thought they knew best, the Pillar Saints of history. But once the Pillar Saint is there, the opposite is also there. So if the Pillar Saint is a mind that hates the body, it's a Gnostic mind that hates the body, then there's also a Gnostic body that hates the mind. Enter Muhammad and Adolf Hitler. I mean, the boy pharaohs of history have caused, most of the havoc. They started the meaningless wars that just went on forever, concentration camps, whatever you have it. And these are men who are not men. It's always a boy pharaoh. That's Mao's little red book, the Quran, and dare I say Mein Kampf are equally bad, all three books. And I've read them all three and they're terrible, right? I'm not a big fan of either of them. But the problem is that the boy pharaoh step forward always there because the Pillar Saint arrived there first. And the Pillar Saint is the boy who doesn't want to play with the other boys. He wants to guard on the forest. He wants to sit on his pillar. And from there, he wants to dictate the world. And then he wants to become an urban planner who creates a perfect world where everything is beautiful all the time. This is completely devoid of sex and violence. Completely devoid of it. You take the sex out of it, you take the pathos out of it, that's what you get. And we need to understand that pathos is an absolute necessity. That gene is out of the bottle historically for good. That's why I think the Dark Renaissance is a good name for the response to this. And I think the liminal web was so much richer, more mature because of it.
I've got a little point to add on about sexuality in game B, because as far as I know, and I'm not super clued up on the space, right? I've heard it being spoken about once, which was a talk with Daniel Schmachtenberger with Eric Weinstein from a couple of years ago. It's about 3 hours in. And Eric basically asks Daniel, okay, but what do we do about sex? Because if we're talking about being non-rivalrous, like maybe to survive, you don't need that much. But actually, sexual selectiveness, you always need more than the other guy in order to be attractive. So there's a kind of never-ending conflict, you could say that. And then Schmachtenberger's response is he says, well, actually, in my own life, I've reflected a lot on this. And I guess the conclusion I've come to is that we need to overcome this kind of sexual rivalry and jealousy. And I think what I take from it is he's saying he's embraced a form of polyamory, which is fine. Like I'm exploring that in my own sexual life as well. But this is not something that's just easily won. This is something that is difficult. There's going to be jealousy. There's going to be rivalry. There's going to be a lot of maturity needed to contain the energies that come up there. And that I've never seen discussed in any of these Game B spaces. I mean, I'm even wondering if people signing up for Game B know that they're kind of signing up for a polyamorous sex cult, or does that just come later? Does that come once you're on the Game B for commune? No, I mean, I'm teasing a bit there. Maybe people in the space have different opinions on this, but this stuff has to be confronted and thought deeply. And to be honest, I'm going to get myself in trouble a little bit here, but there's an organization, right, in Europe called the New Tantra, who have been in the background with, well, certainly leading figures in the sense-making space know they exist, but won't touch them, won't talk to them. And they do training at the intersection of sexuality and spirituality. Like I actually did a podcast with Alexa Bartman, who leads it, where she talks in depth about the training, the different levels that they do. Disclaimer, I haven't been through them, but anybody who's interested in this conversation about psychotechnologies and building kind of spiritual programs, practices for the future, I think this stuff needs to be confronted, because everybody else is just kind of doing meditation and circling and not working with sex. I don't know anybody else who's working with sex, but like I said, it seems like people are scared to go there.
I could just add that that's why I'm dating Alexa Barkman, personally. It keeps my pillar saint in lock, and it keeps her boy pharaoh in lock. And that's how I discovered this idea that the two phalluses must admire each other, because then you can trust them. And I think it's important to point out that TNT cannot even operate in America. They've been legal advice not even open anything in America, because, you know, as soon as you have anybody who goes through that intense, very, very pathical process, and they complain a bitch about it, they go off and see the court somewhere and sue them, and then it's all over. So we live in a world right now that is so oversensitive to anybody making a mistake in that realm. So we live in a ironically, while talking about polyamory, that it's a private matter, we're also living in an environment right now after, you know, Me Too and all that, where we're seeing now the gender wars are becoming real. I think that's a massive tragedy ahead of us. And I think that's one of the, if the dark renaissance has a political motive right now, I would prefer if it's more artistic, but if it does, it would be actually to avoiding and getting over the gender wars quickly. Because I think the gender war, I see it here in Scandinavia, the gender war is just as ridiculous as the Cultural Revolution was under Mao in China, when Mao actually, with his wife, set up children to kill their own parents. I think a culture where men and women go to war with one another is devastating. And that's where we're heading with a lot of this shit right now. A lot of it is heading there because people are so disinformed, unknowing what's going on, or they go to the sort of false prophets out there who won't talk about these things. And I don't want the game B ideology or metamorphism to end up there at all. I think they seriously needs to take on the real issues today. And I'm sorry about climate change and atomic bombs, but they're actually secondary in this case. This is an existential crisis. Certainly with a society now where men and women cannot communicate properly with one another and find a new balance between each other, that's certainly a problem.
I just want to jump in quick, because it's been such a prevalent theme throughout most of what's been said here by all the panelists. Is I think the point Bard was making about it's impossible to be a philosopher today without going through psychoanalysis, which I agree with completely, is that intellectuals throughout history have underestimated the degree to which the concepts they use are really in service of fundamentally intimate problems. So like, take for example, the concept of the one, take for example, the concept of wholeness. What is that intimate need? The intimate need to have a one, the intimate need to be integral. What is that need of the mind? And most of the time, intellectuals are scared to approach these things conceptually, because their entire conceptual framework is going to fall apart if they think about the ground upon which the concepts were derived, which was an intimate ground. So if, in my view, if you're looking to become a philosopher, think about the intimate struggles of your life instead of projecting an image of a global other system or a global other game, like imagining a harmonious, whole harmonious alternative social order, while your personal life is just some sort of individualistic mess. It doesn't make any sense, and it's always the paradox that emerges in these spaces where we too simplistically want to jump to a harmonious whole other society.
It's like the other person who's banned from America besides Alexa Barkman is Karl Marx. Because the other thing avoided here, and it's very pathical, is class conflict. I mean, you cannot sit there and boyishly dream about a future global order of the one and all that without discussing class conflict. I mean, only upper middle class people can afford to even have that kind of a discourse. And it's strictly an upper middle class phenomenon. It's my critique against the Democratic Party in America at the moment is that if they would take class conflict seriously, I would totally support them, but they're not. I think they're going in a completely Rousseauian direction, and they're ignoring Marx. And this is something they imported from Europe when Marxism fell apart and imploded in the 1970s. And instead, Marxism was replaced by a new left that was middle class and not working class, that went for Rousseau rather than for Marx. And we got the identity politics mess and all of that out of that. Identity politics is basically, just like we talked about, avoiding sex means you cannot create art. Avoiding class means you can't do politics. Because if you avoid class, you will end up in all kinds of different minorities fighting each other for attention, which just means they're fighting each other who gets to suck the tit of the welfare state. and the one here, Cadell, I would propose the one here radically, let's go radically. The one here is only the longing back to the matrix. It's a longing back to the womb that women hate because it's completely asexual. It's like when men come to me, okay, so they go through Tantra. When men come to me and said, I want sex and intimacy from women, I said, women don't want that. They want sex and money or whatever they do. They don't want the intimacy, because a man saying, I want to have sex with you, I want to be intimate with you, is basically like a man saying that I want to be both a man who fucks you and I want to be a little boy who sucks your tit. No, intimacy for women in that sense, fundamentally, I think is reserved for children. I don't know what Raven's take is on that. I'm sure she agrees, but maybe has a better wording or something like that. I'd love to hear it. But I think right now what we're seeing is the infantilization of culture. We must struggle with that. We must be open to it, we must critique it. That's what we must do. We must go towards adultification. And that, to me, today, more than anything, means the total embrace of pathos. I would love to see the pornographic version of this animated little Game B movie. Or I would love to see the Game A versus Game B war or something like that, killing each other. So, something more than just a little children's fairy tale story. Yes.
I think we have to get psychology right. We have to understand what we are deeply. And I mean, that's a very difficult task, but like in regards to like our basic claim here that you can't really be philosophical today without going through psychoanalysis, to me, we have to get through this idea that our thinking is derived from an original state. You have to think this about yourself and your thinking, that your thinking was originally derived from a state where you were in a womb for 9 months. That was everyone's original starting point. You were there, you were that. You were helpless, and you were helpless for most of your early existence. You were completely dependent on other people. You had no idea what was going on. Try to imagine what it was like to perceive and sense in that early helpless state. It must have been terrifying. And then think about all of the desire to end conflict, all of the desire to end struggle, all of the desire to have a state of equilibrium. All of that is a death drive, because you don't actually want to be alive. You don't actually want to be thinking. There is no going back to equilibrium other than death. We're far from equilibrium. It's a complex system. There's not going to be an equilibrium other than you're going to die.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, something that I recently learned about actually on the Jim Brett podcast was about the Cambrian explosion, where basically there were all of these soft-bodied creatures that were just living off of the detritus at the bottom of the ocean. And there wasn't a lot of hierarchical complexity in life at this point. And it was actually the act of things eating each other, that the creation of the predator, that began to create the complex world of life. It created things, all sorts of different behavioral dynamics that started to allow for niche construction and the emergence of hierarchically integrated complex ecosystems. The hard body and the soft body, the shell and the inside, right? And it's both of these things together that creates the potential for a complex world, complex interaction, complex engagement. It is both the conflict and the desire to eat and possess and destroy the other, and the fact that we have a vulnerable inside that has to be protected from the predation from others. That is the dynamic that we are engaging in. And of course, as human beings, you can see this play at different levels. You can see the softness of ourselves, the vulnerability of our own existence, our shame, the things that we want to hide, you know, the aspects of ourselves that we all have, but we keep hidden, you know, which also I think leaves us open to manipulation. And that's the thing about this that's actually kind of insidious, is that if you don't engage with this, if you're not engaging with conflict where somebody is totally poking at this thing that's inhibiting you and forcing you to confront it, you are leaving yourself open to being manipulated by someone who can use that insidiously against you. And that means that if you're ignoring this you could end up being sucked up into some sort of situation that steals your life energy from you. And that's a dangerous thing. And we shouldn't want that for the people that we're in a team with, that we depend on, that we're interdependent with, a vulnerability that would be easily confronted if we were only brave enough to actually engage with those parts of ourselves that make us recoil, that make us hide, make us turn away. And the fact of art that really engages with the tragedy of these aspects of ourselves, it brings forth these things as a collective experience. It brings them into vision. It brings them into as an object to be observed that we can engage with. I think comedy also does this, right? And I mean, of course, in American culture, they're like, where did the comedians go, right? Like there's no great comedy anymore. And part of that is, it was exactly what Bard was saying. Everyone just has to stand up there and smile. And a fake smile, a marketing experience where we're performing some sort of simplified version of ourselves so that we can all just kind of get along and project onto each other and not ever having to confront the shadow that is so palpable in the room, right? And and the thing of it is, you can feel this stuff. You can walk into these spaces and feel it if you're in tune with yourself. If you know that stuff inside of you, you can see that other people are hiding from it. It's actually quite obvious. And so being in relationship with people who are forcing you to contend with these things, and I think for me personally, it's caught with romance, sex, and intimacy. That's how you get engaged with these qualities of yourself, with your possessiveness, with your desire to be seen, and yet your desire to be hidden. All of these dynamics come up when you're engaging in the most vulnerable states that you have in terms of engaging with the other. So those are some ideas. I guess I'd love to hear more about this idea, though. It kind of came up in the, I don't know if we can address it, but the parasitic nature of gay may, right? So what if we thought about that as the systems that we're inside of that are actually trying to enslave us? So what about that kind of understanding of the film that came up as a critique in the chat? How would you guys respond to that? That the parasite isn't so much conflict or psychological problems, but rather is the fact that we're living in a cultural environment where there are all of these systemic pressures that create a kind of suppressed human existence or enslavement of humanity. Like this woman more as someone who's being enslaved by the parasite within a system that is attempting to control her. What about that kind of take on it? I can quickly respond to that. There's this ideology that civilization, you might call it in certain circles patriarchy, the idea of systemic pressure creating this enslavement, as if in nature everything was fine. The thing is that civilization was created as a response to problems we were struggling with in nature. It's not that everything was fine in nature. Like, there are actually some really good documentaries and books and stories about what it was like to be in a nomadic hunter-gatherer situation. It wasn't just everything is fine. Life expectancy was very short. It's not like everything was equal and egalitarian. There was differences in status and rank within a tribe. And civilization, like, where are we? I'm constantly in my house online. I'm not in nature in the cold. I don't know where you guys are. Like, this idea that culture and patriarchy or civilization is responsible for all the problems, and that if we just became more natural, things would be peaceful and harmonious. This whole narrative is ridiculous. It's an example of not thinking A equals B. Culture and nature are both a mess.
The man is free in every way, he's in chains, right? That's the Rousseau idea. But I mean, on the subject of the parasite, right? Like, one of the things I was thinking when I was watching it was, there's a great clip you can find on YouTube of Slavoj Žižek analyzing the Matrix. And there's the red pill and the blue pill scene. And he says, do you want the red pill or the blue pill? And the Game B movie is basically a riff on Take the Red Pill, right? She does the thing and she goes in, and Žižek says, I want a third pill, which is not going to show me the reality behind the illusion, but rather show how reality itself is constructed out of illusions that hide truths that are so painful that we can't even confront them directly. And so to apply that logic to the game A, game B thing. So game A, the idea is that the systems have produced the horrible dynamics that exist. The game B thing is that new systems will save us from the horrible dynamics that exist, the parasite. The dialectical point is that, like, no, it's not the systems, it's us. It's humanity itself. And we can talk about having systems that either enslave us or systems that liberate us. But at the end of the day, we're always going to have that feeling of discontent, of malaise. And we will always try and find ideologies to paper over it. That's what Alexander calls the mythos. And that's also kind of necessary to an extent. We kind of need the hero's journey in the children's stories and all of that, and the religions, but then we also need a space to go beyond it. I mean, like, one of the things that's coming out of Cadell's lectures on Hegel at the moment is that Cadell places we kind of have reason. Well, we've got consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirituality, religion, and there's something on top of religion, which is absolute knowing, which is a kind of a state of consciousness that goes beyond the stories that religion is able to tell us of the one and of the kind of unity with the divine. Maybe one of you guys can riff on that a little bit, but that's what my thinking is there.
Yeah, I'd like to say regarding the parasite here, this is the danger of the movie. I mean, but seriously, this could be a Disney propaganda movie ordered by the Chinese Communist Party. Study Pol Pot, Cambodia, right? This is the danger, the real danger here. There are two axes. One axis is the lie that we lived in paradise. Paradise was lost, and therefore we must return to paradise. The only paradise that ever existed were the 9 months you spent in a morphine tent called your mother's womb. You're only longing back to that, and that's what paradise mythology plays into. There never was a paradise. That's why I'm totally opposed to Christianity and Islam. I'm opposed to religions that have afterlives as much as I'm opposed to religions that have reincarnation forever. All of these things are avoiding death. None of them will work any longer. We're at a historical point right now where we need to throw them out. And the Christianity here that goes on to Rousseau and then stops at Rousseau is being recycled here in the Californian version of it. The California version is we lived in paradise, everything went wrong, and must return to paradise. There never was a paradise. Can you get that into your thick head once and for all? Life was horrible. Read an American historian like Jared Diamond to start, just get that nomadic life was absolutely horrible in that sense. Even Yuval Harari's Sapiens is a lying book. The thing I hate about the book is that it buys into the Rousseauian mythology that life was fine before agriculture arrived. No, it wasn't. A woman gave birth to 11 children on average. 9 of them died as soon as they were born, and probably the mother too. That was life before civilization arrived. You don't ever want to go back there, and there's nothing there to find, and you must kill the mythology that does that. So why are these mythologies around? They're around because little boys, or pillar saints, hate sex, and they hate violence. Always watch out when vegetarianism and pacifism both collectively become popular in culture. That's usually a bad sign, right? Because the vegetarianism goes after the hunter and the pacifism goes after the warrior. They both go after man as man who wants to create abundance for woman. So they ruin society in that way. That's a rat right now. This is historian junction rat right now. The way to look at that is to take the other axis here. And that is, besides the fact that we got the Rousseau mythology, is where does it come from? It comes from escaping pathos. It comes from escaping sex and violence, and therefore also making art impossible. The pathical narrative you try to escape is the grown-up narrative. So when students ask me, what is a pathical narrative? I say, anything you don't want your children to see. That's why the animated movie here is a kid's movie. Kids can see it, but it's built on lie. The truth is that we live in a grown-up world. We cannot be children telling children's stories to each other. So we must get that out of the way. We must go into the adult realm. And the adult realm here is sex, power, violence, and also art, because that's the only thing that can transform me as an adult. Is a real, truly artistic experience has to be transformative. It has to include sex, violence, and art. They have to be returned in. So the pathical narrative must be thrown back in, because actually, if you stay with mythos and logos, it becomes the little boy who's completely logos and he wants the world to be logos, and his little Plato and he's 11 years old, and he wants to impress his mom because he wants his mom to tell him a fairy tale, a good night story before he goes to bed. That's logos and mythos, logos and mythos, logos and mythos, avoiding the pathos at the bottom. And this is why there cannot be a light Renaissance here. There can only be a dark Renaissance. We have to include patterns.
Bard, can I just say, because there's been a lot of speech about art, and I agree 100%. Art is one of the, I mean, creating real art and the way real art is created, like Owen was trying to theorize through Nietzsche, is fundamentally important to think. I think we also have to think the emergence of real philosophers and real religious subjects, as well as real artists. And real artists, real philosophers, real religious subjects are the types of thinkers who are really tarrying with these darker dimensions of life, and they become the type of subjects that we idolize, but only by going through the darkness. They don't, and the problem I think with religion, oftentimes, I've been saying this a lot, is that oftentimes religious people want to jump to the highest virtue without actually going into the mess of the passions first. You have to go into the mess of the passions to really understand yourself, and you can pull out of those passions the higher virtues, but they're for real. Like they've been through, I mean, you've become that. You've become that.
Oh yeah, and I would say this. Remember this one word from this conversation: generationism. That's a danger, the biggest danger of culture today, generationism. We talk about sexism and racism. They're problematic, but nothing compared to the generationism we don't even discuss. What's happening right now online is that 11-year-olds talk to 11-year-olds, talk to 11-year-olds. 35-year-olds talk to 35-year-olds, talk to 35-year-olds, and 72-year-olds talk to each other, right? The generations have been completely separated. Here in Scandinavia, where I live, they're totally separated. We've never, ever before in human history experimented with a society where we separated the generations. I still think it's unavoidable. I think it's going to happen. We're going to have to live with it. We cannot just say that this is morally wrong, that we should all get together in some large families, because it's not going to happen. This is precisely why we need to go dark on it, because we cannot say, oh, but this is terrible. Yeah, it is terrible. We know that the wisdoms of the elders and the energy of the youth don't find each other any longer, meaning young people believe they're wise and they turn into Instagram superstars when they're 19 and think they know everything. They're going to go Pol Pot, every one of them. But on the other hand, we have people who are old and just stay within the circle of other old people where they talk to each other all the time and go moralistic about the world and incredibly conservative and nostalgic, you know, but they have no energy. They have no libido. They're going to die soon anyway. And the lack of the communication between generations is deeply problematic. And here is where I refuse to go Platonist on it and say that we should now force generations to get together. We should have a forced Burning Man all the time. We should have 70-year-olds and 50-year-olds being forced to communicate with one another, because that's a typically Platonist, Rousseauian, Pol Pot response to a problem. No. Just begin to comprehend what a massive historical problem we stand in front of. When generations don't talk to each other, when the grandmother won't babysit for the mother any longer, so the mother refuses to have kids. That's where we're at. Those are the real serious problems of the times we live in. Problems that never existed before, that we just created. Because like Owen said, we're just human all to human. We've been thrown into a new technological environment. We have no idea what it is. We have only begun to comprehend it. And I think the only serious futurology says that this is the problem. It has no solution. Now what are you going to do? You cannot say more than that in 2022 and be credible.
Owen, do you want to kind of bring in a final response, and then I'll send it over to Peter and we can go into Q&A?
Yeah, me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that hasn't been said yet, which I guess I should just point to because we talk about it in a lot of our communities, what is missing from the film's depiction, say, of traditional nomadic life? Human fucking sacrifice. And to understand that, go and read a thinker called René Girard, who's written a lot on the emergence of culture and the emergence of religion, and the fact that human sacrifice appears to be a universal. And so we can talk about these lovely nomadic tribes where everybody cooperated. And what was the mechanism by which they cooperated? Well, at least Girard's theory, which has to be carried with seriously, is that they got together and all collectively murdered somebody every now and again to pacify the aggression. Think Nazi Germany, think the Aztecs and the Incas on their pyramids. These dynamics, think woke against the white man now. This is a dynamic that is there. That's what religion, at least in Girard's thinking, emerged to address. Practices and stories to renounce and keep under control the energies that led to the escalations of violence that ultimately needed to scapegoat someone and kill them. So thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, etc. Renounce your passions. And today in these spaces where there's a lot of kind of utopian thinking of almost thinking it's more sophisticated to be spiritual than religious. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Let's just take the practices that teach us to be transcendent and open our consciousness to the divine, but without thinking about desire in any of those things. This is something that we need to look at.
But I don't think we've really fully confronted that maybe crystals and maybe tarot cards could help us here. Like if we all got crystals and tarot cards, and I don't know, like what else could help us?
Well,
Just...
I'm running.
No joking.
Like, okay. Peter, do you want to bring us
question.
into the Q&A? Kind of bring in some of the energy from the audience.
All right. Feel the intensity in the room. Let there be a light in the stoa. Everyone can turn on their camera. And if you have any questions, put them in the chat. Okay, let's see if I yeah, I was talking to someone yesterday about and I think it's helpful when I look at like these scenes like mimetic tribes to distinguish between the philosophers who kind of like consciously or unconsciously midwife the scene with the scene. They're often different. Like Jordan Hall, probably if you plop him in here right now, he's not gonna be like, oh wow, like I'm surprised at what I heard. But like the kind of the scene that people feel, like the game B scene, there's some energy there. And I think it does boil down to like fucking and fighting or fucking and killing, you know, like being kind of like in a relationship with that. And then the person I was talking to yesterday was a woman who went to the session, and she was saying that there's like kind of sexist vibes in the game B scene. And it's kind of like when I feel into it, it's like the good guy, the nice guy brand of sexism in a way, if there is one, or what I called before, like the sneaky fucker energy, like the nice guy mating strategy, where you kind of slip in, you avoid all the rivalrous dynamic between men, and then you be the nice guy and kind of, you know, hope for sex. And so that I wanted to present that. So that's an actual thing happening in movements, intellectual movements, and then the fighting energy, like and I'm curious about Owen, Alexander, and Cadell, because you all do men's work, and I've done men's work as well. And Daniel Kazanjian, who good friend of mine, we had this private group where we just yell at each other every week. And something about men's group is like getting really intimate with receiving another man's aggression, you know, and then having the capacity to like give it back. And as people know, like I wrote about being in bar fights and stuff like that. And there is a pleasure in fucking another man up. You know, there's just like a desire for a man just to dominate. And so those are two things. And I think that's, you know, a lot of intellectual spaces are just like, don't want to look at it, you know, don't have any practice for it. So I'm wondering, like, because since like I'm into this practical philosophy stuff, it's like, so the theory about getting into right relationship, if we want to use those terms, with those two kind of like primordial energies, but practice in order to kind of honor them and express them, for both men and women. So maybe Raven, you can jump in here, like maybe what's the women's version of like all these men's groups activities and practices that have been done. So just for that's a question to open up to the panel. Any kind of like rejection on anything that I said, or just any thoughts that emerged?
I would say that there's a general understanding in men's work these days that nobody wants to be Mr. Nice Guy, and nobody certainly wants to be the sneaker fucker. Once you realize the sneaker fucker is despised both by men and women. So I think it starts with you being 11 years old, your sexuality develops, and you think you're in a game right now, but if you side with the girls, no matter what the girls say, you're gonna get close to them, and you can therefore avoid the sexual rivalry with other men. I've seen a lot of it here in Scandinavia, right? And you end up taking pills and, you know, hating yourself when you're 30 years old or something because it won't work. But it's it's such a massive phenomenon that's exactly why young men seek men's work, because they realize this is not going to work at all. This is not what masculinity is about. And what you then teach them is two things. First thing, you must be heroic at all times. There's an absolute zero tolerance towards victimhood. Out of that comes You must always respect women, whatever women are up to. You can also not go, women hating, anything like that. The men's rights movement, it's completely, it's out of the way. That's not okay. This is the game. This is the biological game. This is sexuality. This is the arena you must step into. But then, to understand rivalry so it doesn't overwhelm you, it helps the guys enormously to work with archetypes. And I mean archetypes here is a pre-Jungian way, like personality types. And whenever you see two men in men's work who are very different from one another, starting admiring each other for their different talents and capacities, that's magic in men's work. And then you can sit in the group with 7 men and get to know them over a few days, and the other 6 guys are totally different from you. And when they tell you the last day what they see as a strength in you, that is genuine masculine strength. That is creative rivalry, because you put the rivalry into the room without necessarily having a bar fight. But then, of course, if the bar fight is what you need, do it. Go all in, right? So I think that's the trick, to always stay heroic and never, ever tolerate victimhood. And when I did men's work, one of the first things I did at one of the events was that I found this guy who was obviously had everything served him in life. And he got a terrible disease when he was like 35 years old and was totally crippled by the day he was 40. When I put him on a stage, and he said that he refused to ever become a victim to himself, that he insisted on being heroic until the day he died. Wow, that shook the room completely. Like those are the kind of role models you need when you do that kind of work. Somebody stays heroic at all times and completely aligned with his masculinity. If you need the bar fight, you go for the bar fight. But if you want to avoid the bar fight and still stay in the masculine, find your archetype, your primary and secondary archetypes, the things you contribute, your major and your minor in life. Go into the room in front of the other man and be proud of who you are, and you'll be fine. And that's the kind of man a woman wants to marry. That's how we do the men's work.
For me, I can jump in here, because before I became an intellectual, I wanted to be an athlete. And like most of my time in high school was dedicated towards training physically. And I think that I basically just sublimated the same basic techniques that I applied to athletics into academics. And I also have maintained always a physical practice, which I think helps me a lot to understand my aggression in a way where it's contained or has a channel. And I think that maybe a lot of intellectuals don't have a balance between an actual physical practice, or they don't see the connection between actual physical practice and intellectual practice. But I think that's been important for me. And whenever I slide in that, I notice a difference. The only other thing I can say is that at the European Men's Gathering last August, there were a few practices related to basically similar to what you were describing, Peter, in regards to getting extremely angry and aggressive and yelling at another man, and also receiving that energy. And I think most of the men I saw responded to that incredibly well. There's just a lot of pent up energy, and there's a lot of and like, before I pass it on to Owen, just saying, like, if that doesn't have an outlet, you're gonna have guys joining things like it reminds me of like a Fight Club movie, like where you have a split subject like Edward Norton, where one part of his identity is like this bureaucratic nice guy, and then another part of his identity is this guy who just wants to mess things up, and that will happen inside of a guy.
Yeah, thanks, Cadell. I mean, I guess I also had the experience of being involved with the heavy metal scene from a young age. So even though coming from quite a typical British middle-class family, and I mean, like, the British middle class are the fucking worst, right? But partying and moshing with extreme music that is like dedicated to exploring aggression and despair, and like kind of feeling that on a visceral bodily level, I think that definitely taught me something. That was a very powerful practice in a sense, that I think there's a lot of kind of vogue in the spirituality scene about embodiment, and it comes a lot from, say, yoga, and yoga is great and all, but there's less on the level of this raw, like, explosive passion, madness that, say, comes out in traditional sports. Probably Osho dynamic meditations come the closest to that, but it's still conspicuously lacking in a lot of more mainstream spaces. And I guess another thought just on this topic is that, and kind of going back to what Peter was saying, there have been issues in my world and collaborations recently to do with tensions and rivalries between people that I think are made much worse by the fact that we're interacting through Zoom, and that we don't live in the same country. Whereas if we could have all gotten together in a room and just gotten drunk and shouted at each other and maybe punched each other and wrestled a bit, then it all would have been let out, and then it'd be like, okay, let's move forward. And to be honest, this is one of the big principles in the men's movements that we're doing, is like, even if we're interacting digitally, we need to get together a couple of times a year and be in physical space to each other, just to process all of that shit that gets pent up when you're talking heads blabbing at each other about philosophy and ideas and dark shit on the internet.
I'm interested. One of the things that you said, Peter, about, I guess, like maybe kind of like sneaky fucker sexism, or, you know, this kind of a sexism in the game B space. It's interesting. You know, maybe I just don't have a good radar for this kind of thing, but I don't know that I've personally experienced any form of sexism that was conscious. But as I think, coming into a greater understanding of what it means to be embracing the feminine as a woman, and actually casting off this kind of masculine mimicry that I think a lot of women have taken on in order to basically make up for the fact that the men are absent in the world and are not actually acting in the heroic capacity that we would like to see. And so there's a kind of, and then there's all the sexes, obviously. That's part of why there's tension and desire, right? I also have part of me that wants to be a man, right? So there's an aspect of that that's both, you know, necessity and also a form of desire to mimic the other I can never be, right? So there's, you know, tension in that, of course. So, but it's just kind of submitting into my own experience and being like, I am a woman, and actually my power comes from embracing and surrendering to that femininity and to the sexual power of that femininity, and the capacity to kind of walk into a space, be in a space, and just shatter the illusion that there isn't any sexual energy moving in the room. If there's just a bunch of little boys there talking about abstract ideas and a woman comes in, a woman totally in her sexual power, holy shit, it's going to completely illuminate that sublimated process, that sublimated part. You're going to see that you're just a talking head, but then you become aware of your other head, the two heads, and then, well, the whole situation changes, right? So, and embracing that aspect of being a woman and holding that power, and knowing that when you walk into a room of men, there is this aspect, and that that's not something to be hidden from, and actually it's something to embrace and to hold as a form of power. As I've been coming into that, I think I've been noticing more that it's not, if we're calling sexism basically a misunderstanding and not knowing how to treat a woman, then yes, I think that that's everywhere. I think that it's a very common thing that men do not understand how to engage with women. That seems to be this ubiquitous thing. And I think also, I mean, we're looking at gender wars as much as we're looking at intergenerational wars, and that this misunderstanding goes both ways. There's lots of women who are telling men that they need to be like a child. And a lot of this comes from the fact that women are not in touch with their own impulse to care and are interested in infantilizing men in order for them to engage with this devouring mother aspect of themselves, right? So I think that that's another dynamic that's going on in terms of the relationships between men and women need to sort out their own caring impulses and allow men to step into their heroic nature without infantilizing them. And men need to realize that women are not their guides in terms of developing their masculinity, that other men are their guides, and that the women will be able to identify a man who can hold the feminine. They will, and it will be abundantly clear. Like, it will be abundantly clear who can do that. It is not something that you even need to try to demonstrate, try to expose. It's just a presence. It's a matter of presence, of heroic presence. And I think very few men are actually in this position. And that creates all sorts of dynamics as well, right? When you have a scarce presence of men who actually have that capacity, that creates gender ratios that are brutal, brutal, brutal. When there's only a few men and there's a lot of women, and there's a lot of men that are being kept out of sexual engagement, of sexual validation, of presence with women, that creates the conflict that generates violence. So they're all thoughts that I'm having, and it feels like, just on a personal note, the more that I become embodied and present in my feminine female power, the more that this becomes just palpably obvious to me. And so I think that the women also have a task, which is to let go of this desire to be masculine, kind of unnecessarily so, right? Like, just let go of it. You don't have to be a man, right? And I mean, I've wanted to be one, I know that, right? Like, but understanding that actually there's much more power in the polarity, and being a polarity in this interdependent relationship with men. It creates this circuit of power that could actually create a vital community, a vital world. That's what I'm interested in, and it is a difficult process. It is a difficult process to engage with, and I think sometimes a little bit of polyamory can actually help. Kind of going back to Owen's point about dealing with all of these things through relinquishing the need to possess. It's an interesting way of playing with all of that. So, Cadell, do you want to tag in on that?
Well, I just loved everything you said. Loved most of everything what you said there. I did. Yeah. We need like the overall point is these intellectual spaces, and this is the point I was trying to make in the main talk, is that these intellectual spaces are often so disconnected from actual intimate life that it's a joke. And the best example you gave was like men in a group talking about abstract intellectual ideas, and then a woman comes in and then there's all, and this comes in the importance of understanding the difference between abstract ideas and the concrete idea. Because it's not that we have to get rid of ideas, we just have to understand what is a concrete idea. And you can't understand concrete ideas without understanding sexual difference. I think the huge intellectual revolution, which is not addressed by Integral, which is not addressed by metamodernism as far as I can see, is to take sexual difference seriously and to think it, and to actually realize the way in which sexual difference is the ground of our civilization. And we have to work with it and know we cannot go back to the womb, and we have to grow up, and we have to stop being infantile in our behaviors and our thinking. And Raven's one of the few, I mean, I just have adored all of my chance to dive into these topics intellectually with Raven, because it's such a rare opportunity. And we need more thinking like this, and we need more spaces where men and women, and we need to consciously shape these spaces and Raven has done a good job of actually leading the way on that. There's a video on the Stoa where she's talking about female rivalry with 3 other women. We need more spaces like that. We need spaces where men talk honestly about their sex life. We need spaces where men and women, I for example, wrote a book called Sex, Masculinity, and God with 2 other guys, where we try to talk about power sharing and conflict, and there's problems with all of these things, but we need spaces where men and women get real about what's going on.
I'm just going to jump in. We're at the bottom of the hour. There's a lot of questions, though. Anyone have a hard stop amongst the panel, or are we cool to go maybe another half hour?
We can go another half hour. I have a hard stop at 8 over here, so that's in 29 minutes.
Cool. So I'll tag team another Stoic, my virtuous partner in crime, Daniel Vizanjian.
Okay, so I agreed with much of what the panel said, so I thought it'd be more interesting if I tried to be uncharitable. And I know Bard loves antagony. So I was thinking, okay, how do I sum up basically the general thrust of this critique of Game B or this metamodern space? And it reminded me of this very profound saying, which is, never trust a man who can't get laid. And I feel like that's the spirit of what everybody's been saying But this saying also has a corollary, which is never trust a man who talks too much about getting laid. And my sense is that that's kind of the spirit of the panel's discussion, and maybe represents the shadow of what's going on in this room right now. And I want to hear how people react to it. And the question on this is, how do we know that we're not merely descending into pathos signaling? You know, we've identified a blind spot in the community and we're like, hey, look, like we're pathical over here and they're missing something. And, you know, we like violence, we like sex, you know, we've read Girard. And what if Girardian dynamics aren't necessary? You know, what if there is a way to actually transcend them and we just get stuck on this little local maximum? So yeah, or like what is a synthesis between pathical realism and these utopian aims of Game B?
I can start with that one. I don't want to get there. I want the dialogos. I want the intense debates. We are obviously here representing the dark Renaissance. Peter Lindbergh asked us to first do this for Zoom and have this contact with you guys. So you get a picture of what the dark Renaissance is. And thanks to the Metamodernism Game B guys for being around, because you helped us identify ourselves. You're our scapegoat right now. We're doing our sacred violence right now because we're turning scapegoat. We're not going to kill you, hopefully, because we want to keep you alive so we can keep the whole discussion going. This is just, I think this is a Kickstarter. I think the liminal web should stop trying to search for a synthesis at all times. I think the liminal web is now mature enough to go adult and stay with conflicts and keep the space open. I think that's what's happening at this very moment. And avoid the synthesis now and keep it a few years into the future as a goal in that case, rather than try to reach it as quickly as possible. Because if you reach it as quickly as possible, you make precisely the mistakes we talk about here. You start having solutions to problems you're not ready to solve yet. You must go through them all the way through before you can actually go for the solution. That's the proper adult approach, dialectical approach towards the solutions we need. Don't jump there too quickly.
I also think I have something to say to Daniel, which is from a Lacanian perspective, sex is not nothing and sex is not everything. So there's a trap of, like, in what I was saying, my response to sort of what you were saying is never trust a man who can't get laid, and also never trust a man who talks too much about getting laid, is sex is not nothing and sex is not everything. And the interesting thing about, at least my understanding of philosophy, which is informed by psychoanalysis, is that the real sublimatory aim here is to realize that we can have just as much joy in speaking and interacting as we can have sexually, that our speech is sexual. So that's sort of the sublimatory angle. And in regards to the idea that maybe Girardian dynamics are not necessary and not everything, that's most of my work. I mean, is I am interested in trying to figure out how conflict and rivalry can be maintained in a more mature way. I think it's not about eliminating conflict and rivalry. I think we have to accept that conflict and rivalry are a reality, but we also have to do that requires a change in the standpoint of the knower or the spirit itself. But I don't think we can get rid of conflict and rivalry, but I do think that the horizon in which Girardians often function is not the end of the conversation.
I can just add one little sentence that, if I may. We are so disturbed and destroyed by advertising and the 20th century advertising language that we think you can only talk to other people about being sales pitchy and only give them good news and avoiding bad news. And that's why it takes forever for people to say something that they really mean, because they're going to give you all the good news first and they want to have a smile on their face while they're talking. That's why the intellectual depot, that's a radically different language. It's boom, 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 boom. And at least for me, it's incredibly refreshing. I can speak my mind and I can save the time, all right? And sales pitch has become a bad word, thank God, because we're so sick of advertising and we're so sick of New Age and we're so sick of people who smile all the time while they're talking that we only see a smiling face being passive aggressive these days for very good reasons. And I think have a much more openly confrontational language and allowing for that would be very liberating.
I really love. Owen, do you want to?
Yeah, you go.
I'm gonna say something. Daniel, I really love what you just brought up in terms of pathos signaling. I think that's an interesting thing to watch out for. And I actually think that that's part of where the art comes in. There is a feeling that you could get into some sort of, I don't know, abstract conversation talking about the necessity for pathos, right? And be totally disconnected from the pathic energy in that very moment, right? So I think that that's totally a possibility. And even here myself, I'm like, oh God, could I go into examples of what art is talking about in terms of the pillar saint and, you know, the man and the masculinity? Like I could just talk all day about that in terms of the particularities of my life and my love life and sexuality and like dealing with rivalry and sex. Oh my God, right? Like I've been I've definitely seen it. I've seen it because here I am as a woman watching men behave around me and desire me and experience this, right? But there's something about being in an intellectual space where you begin to talk about these things in terms of kind of abstract categories. You're trying to understand them as systems. And I think that and this is where Cadell, I think, is kind of bringing in this idea, okay, you can speak about this stuff in this way, but as long as it's rooted in something concrete, and actually the poetic or the grasp, you know, the reach for words is like this, the connection with the embodied experience and that within language. And, you know, there's this desire to move through language to try and invoke these underlying principles that, you know, on a personal level, we're finding ourselves looped inside of continuously, looped inside of the passions, looped inside of these conflicts that continuously perpetuate themselves until you can find a way to transcend. To embrace the heroic, I think, is really a great way of understanding that in terms of a symbol, in terms of its kind of mythological understanding. But I think that this is the thing about art. For example, I don't know if anybody knows this, and Coleman Hughes is this amazing Black man from New York City who, you know, he famously kind of testified against reparations for Congress. He recently released a rap album that is like, totally, to me, I listened to this rap album and I saw his music video Blasphemy, and I was like, this is it, dude. Like, this is what we're talking about. This is this person who's like in one arena, he looks like Sam Harris. He's like very rational and very particular and like very clear with his thinking. And in this other arena, he's expressing himself in this totally pathic, aggressive nature, using rap music as this medium and talking about his dick, talking about, you know, his impotence, his frustrations, his anger, his aggression, and his bragging, right? Bragging about his masculinity, about the things that he can do, about the men that can't hold him back, all of this stuff, this exposure of his shame and him saying, look, this is not something that can control me. Total exposure. And I think that that's the kind of thing that is the greatest channel for this pathic energy. Like we can try and reach it with language and we can try and explain it, but in a way, maybe it's always going to be pathos signaling until you're actually producing the art, until you're actually channeling this into something that is resonant and is the proper container for actually completely engaging the senses. And that's the thing about music. Right? Like not only is there words in the rap that are talking about these things, not only is there character that he takes on that's allowing him to have a conversation with himself in the music, but there's also the beat and the samples that invigorate the body as you're listening to the story, right? So that's the kind of thing where I think you potentially transcend the state of signaling and enter into something that is a true synthesis or true engagement, a true kind of expression of the concrete, visceral, honest exposure of the intimate self through all of these various mediums into a cohesive piece of music or of performance or of art. And so there's potentially just never a possibility of engaging fully with this until we're engaging with art, until we're engaging with these various mediums. So that's what I would share.
Great. I guess my response to Daniel would just be that we also have to be aware of the degree to which bourgeois politeness conditions how we think about communication. Like what you've called pathos signaling. I mean, that's kind of what especially men do when we get together and we get drunk. we talk about our dicks, we talk about fucking and fighting and tell stories about that. And there's actually something that's quite, I think, integral to male behavior about it. It's kind of, and I know Raven's not a man, but I think she can kind of, she can vibe with us to an extent. Like there is this degree of just kind of testing each other to see if you can trust each other. That's where it comes from. And I happen to know that Cadell, Alexander, and Raven, and indeed the rest of the people kind of broadly associated with this Dark Renaissance thing. Yeah, like we talk a lot of talk, I guess, but I also do think and know these people walk the walk. Like there are a lot of projects going on and a lot of cool collaborations. And so, yeah, I think if it comes across as a little bit vulgar or excessive, that's part of it. And it's part of the fun of doing it. So it's not just this nice, polite, dare I say, slightly too stoic way of communicating.
Any share, Daniel?
So I'm not offended by that last comment because I'm a recovering stoic. I guess, yeah, I really like what Raven said about art. And I feel like that connects with what Bard was saying earlier about staying heroic at all times. And I think, Owen, what you said kind of helped me refine what I was trying to point out, which is, I don't think there's necessarily an issue with this type of conversation. I don't think it's vulgar or offensive. I just think it's not the thing, you know, it's like a waypoint on the way to something. And I want to make sure that I don't get caught up in it personally.
But what is the thing?
Probably can't be named.
If we're not being offensive enough, maybe we need to take it up a level.
I'd say, I think today where we're at, pathos was lacking, and we're stuck in the logos mythos dyad, where we should be in the triad. I could easily imagine being a society where the logos is lacking. That's when it goes completely insane. I can easily also imagine a society where there's no mythos, because if there's no story tying people together, there's no mythos in society. And for example, usually when I'm in an all-male environment, it ends up being a logos and pathos division. And then woman comes to represent mythos. I don't want to speak for women, but I think women feel they're much more unified than men are. And the attraction towards men is that they're split between the logos and the pathos. So there's a sexual dynamic in that mythos is owned by women. I know Jake did one little beautiful thing with this animated movie. He let it be 3 elders, 1 woman, and 2 men. And that's not discriminating against women. It's because women only need 1 representative, and that's the matriarch. Because she's got to pick up everybody so they walk the next day, right? But the phallus has to be split. So the reason the 2 guys is because no single guy can represent the men, because then you get the tyrant. So the way to split the tyrant is to not allow the priest and the chief to ever be the same person or even be remotely close to each other, but only admiring each other. So my response to Daniel is that I'm not afraid of being pathos-centric or pathos signaling or whatever, as long as that is what I desperately think is needed in contemporary Western culture. But in a different environment or at a different time, I would fight for any of the other 2 narratologies, because there's a constant conflict between the 2 narratives. And in any society, watch out when one of them is lost. Just like if the Supreme Court would disappear in America, you only have the Congress and the president, America would fall apart in a few years. Triads are stable over time. And the triad is the answer against the Chinese Communist Party and its fantasy about making Xi Jinping the king of the world. Where's the priest? And where's the matriarch? That's exactly what Xi Jinping in China will eventually implode and be deeply problematic, because the only stable systems over time are triadic, and therefore they encourage dialectical processes, and that's the only good news we have.
I would also go against the idea that we're even pathic centric, because I think we combine pathos and logos. I think that's what we do really well. I think we're thinking, we're fundamentally philosophical, and we're also trying to not repress or pretend as if pathos isn't there. And there's one aspect of that I think I want to make a philosophical point about, something that I also said in the main speech about A equals B, as opposed to A towards B, which is that we're already there, meaning that this whole way of thinking that we're on the way towards something is, I think, what I would call Kantian thinking, whereas Hegelian thinking is you're already there. You're already the thing. It's not, we're not there and we're trying to get somewhere. That is a type of spurious infinity which never actualizes anything. We're already there. You just have to think paradox of the present moment. I think that's, I mean, that's what we're trying to open up, I think.
Or at least for men, I would like to add that if you look at the Silk Route, and you know I love the Silk Route, and if you look at the maps, you would have to go through both a fight club and a whorehouse before you were allowed into the bazaar. And then after the bazaar, you went to the spiritual center for yoga meditation and passed all the shit out of your head until you went to the next town, and then went into another fight club and another whorehouse before you went to the bazaar. That's how traders operate. And I think if you don't want to have the fight club and the whorehouse on the picture, you cannot go into the bazaar and do the trade, because you have a bazaar for little boys who all want to be Stalinists. That's what you get.
Every time I hear Bard saying little boys who want to be Stalinists, I just want to like fuck something up. I don't know what. You know, I really want to sneak in Aaron's question because it's really fucking good. So Bart, if you have to slip out at the hour, feel free to just pop off, and you know, a lot of gratitude. But let's take in Aaron, because this question is a really good one to end with.
Thanks, Peter. So a lot of this conversation has focused around what seems to be, to me, to be like a masculine pathos. As far as like sex and violence, the violence seems like very masculine to me. And Raven's talking about Coleman Hughes, is expressing, you know, his pathos, talking about his dick and how like men can't keep up with him. And like you might have like a female also rap about like her sexuality and how like other women like can't touch her, and like, but that still seems like a masculine pathos to me, just being expressed by a female. So if we're talking about like the need for like this dark side, are we in touch with the female dark side, and do we know what that looks like? Because that seems to me like it's been kind of absent from the conversation in some ways. So riff on that however you see fit.
Yeah, I guess as the woman, maybe I'm supposed to speak first on this issue. I would say that this is a question for me. I've been thinking about this and feeling into it myself. And actually, I think who really got me thinking about this was actually a woman that Bard introduced me to, named Fanny Norlin, who is this just incredible woman and based in Sweden. And she's doing a lot of work on feminine leadership, which is really bringing her into direct relationship with feminine sexuality. And one of the things that she said in an interview with Greg Henriquez that I was listening to was that the feminine sexuality is standing on the edge of the void. And the masculine is to hold the feminine, so that she can just fully engage with the void. And the void, you know, one of the things we talked about in the family symposium with me and Cadell and some others the other day was about time. And the experience of time, kind of when you get into these really intersubjective states, is nonlinear. And it doesn't really fit very well with the kind of regimented Platonic structure of the outside world. And women, when they're trying to engage in both realities, find themselves having to integrate two polarities, essentially, when in fact the feminine in its full power is totally leaving behind that Platonic structure and standing on the edge of the void and being immersed in this kind of singular experience that is associative. It's connected to the oracle. It's connected to just this kind of like voice that's exposing visions and dreams. And it's not rational, you know, it's not like systematic. It's not it's not that kind of language. It's a poetic language. It's a storytelling language. It's a mythological language that comes from the void. And it may not fit in very well with this kind of regimented logos, especially if that logos doesn't have room for it, right? So I think in terms of what a musical expression of female sexuality is, I think it's potentially someone like Billie Eilish would be an example. Her music is connecting to conflict and intimacy and pain and beauty and frustration of growing into being a woman, and it's beautiful and it's tender and it's powerful and it's sexy. It like has all of those different elements that draw from that pathic experience. So maybe it's not going to be rap music, or maybe we see women kind of mimicking men in rap music, but there's also, I think there is also this edge. Women are aggressive. That's the idea that women are not aggressive, I think, is so we are and it's maybe a different form of aggression at times, but yeah, I guess those are my thoughts. I don't know. This is an open question for me, especially as I think about kind of extending my experience of the feminine and my perspective into artistic mediums. What calls to me? What kind of aesthetic experience do I feel expresses and contains my subjectivity? That's an exploration that I'm on at the moment, and I think I'm excited to see more women honestly engage with their self-exposure through the expression of music and art. So
I totally agree with, in case I need to pop out here, I just want to add that art is completely sexual. Art is definitely women and men. Great art is both. So the pathical from men and women are always united in art. And okay, so I identify myself with masculine art, but when I go see feminine art, it's just a totally different world opening up. And hey, that's what I love about my girlfriend. She gives me a completely different worldview than what I have. Like, you want to see the world that way? Okay, that's man and woman being attracted to each other. So woman cuts man's pathos, so he cannot go into the logos, and he cuts him out of the logos so the man can stay within the logos pathos and within that division. That's why men are divided, fundamentally divided. It's very Camille Paglia, she's absolutely right about that. So I would say that's striking. I would also like to point out that I love Fanny too, and Raven. And Fanny and Raven are the artistic equivalents of what Fanny and Raven are doing here, philosophically speaking, would be somebody like Lana Del Rey or say Billie Eilish. And I don't mind the rap girls either. I don't think they're actually mimicking the masculine. They're making a parody out of being ironic about it. But it's actually, if you look at the team who work with, say, Candy B or Nicki Minaj, it's always gays and girls. It's gay guys and women doing it. And that is radical. Gay guys and women always do great art together. They say pop for it was Madonna's gay brother who saved her career until she ruined it herself, right? When the day she kicked out the gay brother, her career was over. It was actually the electricity between the gay guy and the girl. And when I worked in the music industry, I always watched out for these gay guy and the girl relationship because they were incredibly creative and very artistic. So there's so many ways of doing this. I like to propose a term. If Raven and Fanny don't mind, I'll throw it after them. I call it post-feminism. And what I mean post-feminism is a feminism that realizes radical feminism was a dead end, went back to classical feminism, typical dialectical turn, went back to classical feminism and said, is there anything wrong with being a woman? No. Are women powerful? Yes. And then they went straight into their feminine power, which Raven and Fanny work with all the time. And I think the feminine power in its own true forth has enormous potential right now, but it's not going to end up with any harmony or balance. No, it's going to dance at the edge of the void, and it's going to cause havoc like mad, but it's going to be artistically fantastic. And I think the term post-feminism that some of these girls in Scandinavia are using is so good. And I would love to see the conflict between the post-feminist and the radical feminist, where the post-feminist will be heroic and the radical feminist will be exposed for the victimhood that they're actually preaching.
So I can say on the topic of feminine pathos, I guess, well, first off, there's the way in which woman is subject to a law that is totally different from the law of this world, the law of civilization, the law of men. And that's kind of most clear just in the menstrual cycle. The woman's body does stuff completely of its own accord, whereas men are all concerned with building structures and thinking stuff through and blah, blah, blah. Like a woman's body is going to do stuff to her throughout the month from the time she's fucking like 13 or something. And she's got to live with that for the rest of her life. And then at the same time, like she literally can grow life within her without having to consciously think about it. And this is something that's kind of been interesting to artists for a long time. I mean, like you can go and read, for example, Sophocles' Antigone, which is kind of exploring this conflict between the masculine world of power and politics and the feminine law of interiority and, well, perhaps the family and her own kind of, her own terrain. And there's clashes between these. Another thing, and this is kind of building on Paglia kind of in one of the early chapters in her book, Sexual Personae, sets up this dichotomy between these two figures from ancient art, the Venus of Willendorf, which is this kind of like bulging, feminine, flabby, featureless, it's like breast and belly and butt, and it's amorphous, and it kind of looks like mud and crushed leaves. It's like, and she associates that with this like menstrual energy, with the fact that woman's body is so close to these almost like brutal cycles of nature. And then against that, she sets Queen Nefertiti, the bust of this Egyptian queen, which is just like incredibly sharp lines, eyeshadow, sculpting, the body even removed. And her analysis of this is basically like, this is a response to the amorphous bulge of nature, is this like brutal glamour. That's what lipstick is. That's what high heels are. That's what dresses are. And we shouldn't be naive about what glamour is. Like glamour is a kind of fascism, and it's savage, and it exerts an incredible amount of power. And I think when a woman, as Raven was kind of going towards, is in her sexual prime, she can play with men like a cat plays with mice, and she gets incredible joy from doing so. And that is the power of glamour. And so this is where women can play. And it's also, come on, let's admit it, it's fucking brilliant. We love it.
Guys, I'm out of here. I'm off to a Russian podcast tonight. There you go. It's going to be quite different. Big love to you all, okay?
Take care, Mark. Cadell, would you want to close off with anything?
Well, I can close with something about violence, which is not necessarily related to sexual difference, but it's something that's on my mind, and it's been on my mind a lot lately, which is for me, the state beyond the Girardian mimetic rivalry, because I've been trying to think that a lot, is basically something related to becoming so consciously aware of your violence that you start to be terrified of what your actual motivations are, and you're capable of almost turning that in on yourself to organize your being, to organize your self-identity for death. And I think that that's something like what I would call absolute knowing. Absolute knowing is almost a state where in some sense you're already dead, but you're still engaging with the phenomenological drama. And in regards to like something very concrete that I'm going through now, is that I'm recognizing more and more that there are a lot of young people who are going to want to sort of like symbolically kill me, or symbolically, you know, like if I'm a teacher or if I'm someone they look up to, eventually they're going to want to kill me and overcome me. And so I think that in that regard, I think that we need to be able to set up, like, to me, what a game A equals game B means is that we need to set up a world where death is fundamentally a part of the developmental and intergenerational structure. It's not that we're in game A going towards game B, it's that we're in a constant paradox of development between multiple generations. And there are certain people at the sort of developmental end of the spectrum which need to come to terms with death and still become a wise leader in the process. Maybe that's the final thing I want to say.
All right. So yeah, love this session. A lot of it felt like it moved the energy forward here at the Stoa, and perhaps in a wider space. And I'm going to read something that Jake, the filmmaker of the game B, wrote in the chat earlier. So dare I say, this was beautiful. Mad respect for starting this. After we all have one big orgy, I look forward to collaborating with the Dark Renaissance on the next film. So you have a potential filmmaker for the Dark Renaissance. And yeah, there's some people are putting some links for a post session. I have to leave, but you can check out the Zoom link. I'll post Ron's here. And yeah, so everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa. Bard, who just left, Cadell, Owen, Raven, give them a round of applause. Philosophy as art, as always. And you can check out more events at the thestoa.ca. And we'll leave by listening to Daniel Schmachtenberger sing us out. So.